Antonio Girola, and welcome to my second PowerPoint and voice-guided YouTube video for the Formal Organizations class in Sports Markets. Specifically today I'm going to be discussing stadiums, local budgets, and the subsidies that have been created as a norm nowadays. So, in order to talk to about the modern day conversation on subsidization and subsidies for sports stadiums and sports venues, we have to look at the history of it. So, in the early 1910s to about 1920 is when we first started seeing efforts for sports team stadiums to be subsidized or funded by local and state governments. But back then, design efforts focused primarily on a bang-for-buck approach, or kind of like the ability for a stadium to be used in as many events as possible, so that the city, as well as franchises, can best use the space, and it doesn't only cater to one business, it would cater to the needs of the whole city. Although, at that point, private funding was still the main source of funding for stadiums, which is in stark contrast with today. So, how do public subsidies work? Under current federal tax law, both local municipalities and larger city governments have the ability to issue taxes and bonds to fund sporting franchises' efforts to build new stadiums. Essentially, local governments have two options when attempting to get a franchise to stay in their home city or to recruit them to their city. They can first draw from current budgets, which would limit available funds in the current sense for helpful city programs to feed the impoverished, the hungry, education, law enforcement, fire department, and just about any other city program. Or they can take the far more popular option of raising funds via bonds from investors, in which they guarantee a return on investment plus interest in the long term. So, of the last 45 major stadiums built since 2000, 36 were financed through tax-free municipal bonds. And so, if you look to the chart on your left-hand side, you can see a list of the top 10 federal subsidies for sports stadiums. With Yankee Stadium at $431 million, Soldier Field $205 million, Citi Field $185 million, and as you keep going, you see multiple hundreds of millions of dollars in federal subsidies and local subsidies for these stadiums. Now, like I said previously, times are changing. Where it was once a common occurrence for private funding to be the dominant factor in building these new stadiums, in which owners would go out, raise capital, and make deals that may cost them money, it has shifted now. Now, local governments are footing the bill. If you can see in this graphic, it starts in 1960, and it shows the blue as being public funding, and you can see it's almost doubling, tripling, quadrupling the instances in which public funding is becoming far more popular than the red, which is private funding. So, current major subsidies to date, if you look to Clark County, Nevada, which is not too far from Las Vegas, you can see a $750 million subsidy for the Raiders' new stadium, and as well as you look to Arlington, Texas, $500 million in subsidies for the new Rangers stadium, and an even larger bill of about $5.3 billion, mostly in subsidies for the 2028 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles, California. Now, while this practice is becoming more popular, economists continue to oppose it. There's a consensus among economists that subsidizing sports stadiums is actually harmful for economic prosperity, preservation of the market, and that the large sweeping initiatives actually fall short of their often advertised benefits. Now, subsidies are usually given as a result of market failure, or a case in which The market is failing to act, and it needs some form of government intervention to drive it, such as farmers receiving subsidies for corn production, in which the government has an interest in keeping corn production for the long run, even though it may not be necessary now. That's not the case for sports stadiums. There will always be a market for sports franchises um, as Americans love sports. They spend a great deal of money on merchandise, visiting the games, watching the games. And markets for large sports franchises are actually in excess in the U.S. Moving a stadium or team does not equate a failure of the market. It instead is a smart business move in which a team owner can get a better deal to better fund their stadium aspirations, or to move to another market that may provide more opportunities to sell merchandise or to sell television rights. And so the ability to move teams around proves that the market is very capable to function on its own and does not require government intervention. Now, there's still going to be a need for capital to build new stadiums, and instead of government funding, capital investment campaigns can be launched on the private market, in which adequate funds can be raised to build the stadium, and then investors can be paid for investing in this project, rather than relying on taxpayers' money. Building on to what I said before, there is a large demand for professional sports teams. Most major cities and states and their citizens would kill to have a home team. Thus, the market has adequate room to find the best deal and business opportunity without government intervention. Now, if you look to the larger league structure, leagues limit their membership to ensure maximum profits on the part of each franchise. So team owners have a monopoly with no competition, as there are not many large organized leagues, and so team owners can operate and negotiate with local governments without having any other opportunities or competing offers. If you look to the example of Robert Kraft threatening to move and using Hartford as leverage to get Massachusetts to fund their new stadium, and pump more capital in. So why do governments fund stadiums if the economists are against this? Cities are able to project their city on the world or national stage. There's also a belief that new stadiums will bring tourists, fears that they will lose teams to other cities, and seem that they are less important or less dominant economic centers. There's also a large sentimental value for voters in having their team at home, and there's a belief that jobs will be created in completing the project. Consequences of the current situation. Owners have all the leverage in negotiating stadiums improvements by threatening to leave. Profitable owners and teams get away with not having to fund the very stadium that is responsible for raising for the revenue, because without a stadium, there is nowhere to watch the team play, thus they can't make money without the stadium. Owners are also allowed to play with the emotions of their fan base for their own financial benefit, without regard for their fan base, of which really, really does care about their team and the prosperity of their team. Furthermore, most of the funding goes right to the franchise and to powerful construction and development companies, rather than being cycled back to the average taxpayer. And then there's another large problem that comes up of eminent domain and gentrification associated as these projects become larger and larger parts of city development and revitalizations of programs that directly drive out low-income individuals. And then small businesses are also replaced in a similar way by corporations, as these projects include malls with corporate stores and corporate restaurant chains, rather than the local small businesses that are already operating in the region. So, for example, you can look to the recent efforts from the Mets and the city of New York to try and create a new region where Citi Field currently is, with a new stadium, hotels, malls, and stores. There's been significant protests by body shop owners as well as local residents in fear that their rent will go up, their businesses will be removed through eminent domain, as it's largely an automotive industry, and there's not another region in New York City in which they can move at an affordable rate. So their businesses are being threatened, and they're being offered pennies on the dollar for the value of their property because the city is the main negotiator on behalf of the Mets organization.